from Shanghai to the world, and I'm very excited to have my own coach here with me, Fionn. Thank you so much for your time, especially before you're traveling back in the world and saying goodbye to China. So for our listeners who are not only from China, but from the world, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself.
Sure. I mean, I'm originally Irish. I grew up in Africa. I'm kind of a global international citizen. I university in North America, and then spent most of my adult life actually in China. I've been a coach, mostly like one-on-one coaching, then training, entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, like to set up businesses and build things. But I do mostly one-on-one coaching, and that's what I'm really passionate about. That's what I really enjoy. It's just being like this with people, learning who they are, seeing how I can support them, and leveraging the toolbox that I've learned over the years to be able to do that.
And I remember you have a huge toolbox, because when I became your client, you gave me that list and you said, okay, it's not only that I can help you with this, but also I use these and these techniques. And I was like very surprised and at the same time amazed. Yeah, so good job on that.
Thank you.
Beyond that, I also know that your Chinese skills are very outstanding. And also many people were able to see you on TV. They can read your amazing LinkedIn posts. Can you tell us a bit more about that part of you?
Yeah, so I mean, China has always been a passion of mine. In fact, even since I was very young. I remember, when I was small, I had this, I'd watch Jackie Chan movies and, loved going to the Chinese restaurant to eat with chopsticks. And at the age of 12, I got to travel to Shanghai. And
wow.
It just blew me away. It was like I was stepping into a sci-fi future. Huge skyscrapers everywhere, and these like roads on top of roads on top of roads. I didn't realize, when I thought of China, I thought of like, the pointy roofs and the kind of old style that you see in the movies. And I hadn't realized it was so developed. So when I first set foot on the ground here, it really surprised me. And so from that age of 12, I always wanted to come back. And so during university, I came back here and studied at university here, and I studied Chinese. And that was actually my favorite part of my whole university experience, was just being able to travel around the country here, getting to know the people, getting to know the culture. And at that time, I also met who's currently my wife, fell in love, and it's a bit of a happily ever after story. I have 2 kids, and so I feel like I've integrated into the culture here. And so that's allowed me to be able to go on TV and speak, not just as a foreigner from a foreign perspective, but as a foreigner who's integrated into the culture, who is raising, half Chinese kids, and has, Chinese grandparents looking over my shoulder and, saying what I should, what I shouldn't do, and being able to turn to them and speak to them in Chinese and say, well, this is how I'm raising my kids, and I choose to do it this way because this is my culture. Being able to find that midway balance, right? And that's often the things that I talk about on TV in Chinese, is different ways of parenting. How can we be more conscious in the way that we parent? And I think that, Chinese people often find that quite revealing for them, in that, oh, here's a foreigner who, he's not just foreign, he can speak our language, right? He can share, he can talk about Taoism and Buddhism, and he can talk about Confucianism and how he adapts those principles to parenting his kids. And that helps them expand their way of thinking of, well, what is actually possible for the way that they can be with their families and be with their children.
Can you share a few of the tips in case we have any parents watching here? Because I've seen only parts of you also when it comes to your work and life balance. Give us some tips, or what are your principles?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that you have to be aware of is context matters. So, what I might do here in China versus what I might do in Canada versus what I might do in Ireland are all actually different, And so when I say context, that could be geographical context, but it could also be, different context in terms of different personalities of children. And I think that often gets missed when we talk about parenting or raising kids, is what is the right parenting technique? It's like, well, it depends on your child. What personality are they? What are their love languages? What are their passions? What are they actually good at? And so we even see that in our family, where I have 2 boys who are only 2 years apart. They're super different in terms of their personalities. And so it requires a different type of parenting technique to deal with each of them. to meet their needs in a specific way. And so that's one of the things that I often recommend parents is to get away from this idea as like the perfect parent or the right parenting technique, and to just look at your child, to understand them, to see if you can come more and more from their perspective and how they see the world, and then communicate, right? It's about learning, what do they like, what do they not like, how do they like to do things. And the thing is, if you listen, your children will tell you. But it's not always that easy to listen because, we have certain ideas in our head of expectations of they need to perform at maybe a certain standard according to the school curriculum or according to other kids at their age. And as much as possible, if we can let go of that expectation of what it is that other parents or other children at that age might be doing, and just meet our children where they are, understand where they're coming from. And, if we actually look back at the Taoist principles, like the Chinese philosophy, ancient philosophy, in a really beautiful way, that's what Taoist philosophy is about. It's about going with the flow, right? It's about not having this kind of set, structured way of doing things, but just allowing nature to flow with you. And so our children are a gift in that way. They help us. They help us be able to see sides of ourselves that otherwise would remain hidden. And so that's one of the real gifts that I talk about when it comes to parenting is how can we grow with our children, as opposed to thinking that we've got it figured out. Let our children teach us how we can be better people.
Would you mind sharing one example? You just mentioned that there are hidden spots. They're only coming out thanks to our children. I have no idea what are these hidden spots that you have discovered thanks to your children now.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. So my two sons are about 2 years apart, and so often what you'll find is that they argue about things or they fight about things because they often want the same thing. And so we were in an elevator, and they both want to press the button, but they want to press it at the same time. And they're all doing this, it's like in real time, there's not all that much time to react, right?
Yeah.
So one of my sons, my youngest, goes to press it, and the other one goes to hit his hand away. And so I'm there in the middle trying to be like, how do I both protect the little one, but also, be gentle? And so I grabbed his hand and I pulled it back. And I did it quite forcefully.
Okay.
And he obviously wasn't happy with that. He said, Daddy, you hurt my hand. And I was like, well, you were about to hit your brother. I was trying to protect him. And so we drove home on our scooter after that. And we kind of got to our house, and I said, what we're all going to do? We're all going to go and sit down in the thinking spot. This is what we do when we have to think about something. So we go and we sit down in the thinking spot, and we can think, or we can meditate, or we can just sit with whatever has happened. And so I said, all three of us are going to sit, because we all did something that, maybe is not what we were supposed to be doing. Right? So we all go sit down, we sit kind of in our meditative state, the three of us sitting together. And I really do, I take it seriously. So I look inside and I think about, yeah, I did hurt him. I didn't mean to, but it happened. And, it's important that I acknowledge that. So I turned to him and I said, Griffin, that's his name. That's my 8-year-old. So, Griffin, I'm really sorry that I grabbed you so hard. I think probably that also comes from my childhood. That, when I was growing up with my parents, they were a little bit, rough with me. And so I haven't quite learned yet how to be as loving and gentle with you as you deserve. And I started crying.
Wow.
And he looked at me and he said, oh, Daddy. He hasn't seen me crying very much. Daddy, why is there water in your eyes? I said, Griffin, I'm crying. I said, why, Daddy, why are you crying? I said, because I'm sad, because I hurt you. And I shouldn't have hurt you. I'm sorry about that. And he runs over and he gets some tissues and he comes back and he starts,
Even I feel it.
And that made me want to cry even more, because here's my 8-year-old son. And this is something my wife has been trying to teach me for years. When she starts getting emotional, that I get some tissues and give it to her. And often I'm just stuck in the moment as a coach trying to help her. And so here is my 8-year-old showing me, how to go and get tissues and take care of me. And that really helped open up a relationship between us, right? Where I can admit fault, I can admit mistake, I can tell him when I've made a mistake, and I can be sorry for it. And that allows him to admit his mistakes too. Now it's not always a battle for him to kind of say, oh, I didn't do this wrong. It's like, well, sometimes I make mistakes and I can admit that. And, what did you do today? And how can you learn from that?
And how did he respond at the end then? I mean, like, you all were in a thinking spot, and I don't know, do you have a special place inside your apartment for this, or can it be done anywhere? That's my first question. And secondly, how did he react from his path, basically, like, because he was also thinking and your other boy was also thinking? What was their response?
Yeah, so we do have a special place for the thinking spot, but it's also somewhere that can be spontaneous. So if we're outside somewhere, or if we're traveling or something like that, we can also create a thinking spot. And in terms of his learning, his development, his growth as a human being, every day is a journey. Every day is a chance for us all to learn together. Just yesterday was an opportunity, where he was getting a little bit angry, and he wanted to hurt himself, and that's his way of kind of looking for attention. Is like, I'm gonna hurt myself, so like bite myself like that, or something like that, to show that I'm really angry and I want something I'm not getting. So I originally would be more like, okay, let me protect him from hurting himself. We have this thing called the loving octopus. So I just like hold him, and I have all these tentacled arms that just hold him lovingly. And this time he was forcing me. He was trying to hurt himself. So I said, let me step back. Okay. So
what happened?
If you're gonna hurt yourself, I'm gonna be a team with you, and I'm gonna bite myself too. And if you're hurting, I'm gonna hurt too. And he's such an empathic kid. So he thinks, no, daddy, I don't want you to be hurt, he says. And so I see in him this empathy that comes out, that comes from this place of deep care. And it often he'll identify within, a situation that's happening. He might say something like, because of a time like that where I said to him, I was rough with you because when I was young, when things come up and maybe I'm not doing things the way he would like, he turns to me and he says things like, Daddy, are you doing this because when you were young, your parents did this to you? And that makes me stop and pause and reflect for a while. Like, well, often it is. And then sometimes he goes even a step further and he says, and did your parents do that to you because when they were young, their parents did that to them?
Oh, wow.
And so he's seeing this like generational, he doesn't call it trauma because that's kind of quite a complex topic.
Yeah.
But he's seeing this kind of generational follow through of behaviors that are maybe not behaviors that we want to continue in this generation. And so he can reflect back to me, when he's not feeling something, when he feels like I'm not doing something well, is this actually a behavior or a dynamic in our family that we choose to follow through on this generation? Or do we consciously choose conscious parenting, right? Do we unconsciously follow through the patterns that we've had? Or do we consciously choose to shift that pattern and shift our behavior so that doesn't get passed on to the next generation?
And what's your source for all of these techniques and learnings in order to use that in your parenting?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where, I started off coaching more on it was actually, in college, more of like a dating coach type of thing, helping people figure out how to, deal with the opposite sex. And
really?
that was an area that I was really interested in when I was that age.
I can't believe that.
And
now you're so settled.
Exactly, and so I moved through that period and I felt like I found someone that I was really happy with. And as I started coaching, I just found that people would come to me with more and more different things. And in order for me to be able to coach people, I really need to be able to walk the talk. I need to be able to be doing it in my life. And I found, people would come to me and they were parents, and they'd be, having trouble with their kids. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I mean, I can maybe come up with logical ideas or NLP techniques we use with the kids or whatever. But in reality, it's about how do I deal with other human beings and can I relate that? And if I haven't learned that, I need to go away and study. So that was one of the things that, my wife was a little bit skeptical about when we were having kids. I'm kind of a coach and I like to think that I know human psychology and things like this. And she's like, well, yeah, but do you really know how to educate our kids? Or do you know how to do these kinds of things well? Because I actually wanted to homeschool our kids. And she was, very skeptical about that. So she's like, well, you got to prove it to me. Do you actually know what you're doing? So I went away and I did a master's in sort of like human development, so that human development goes all the way from kids all the way to adults, and understanding that whole spectrum of how do we develop in healthy ways through these different stages of development. And so going away and learning that and reading all these books and then applying it to my own family, to my own life, that for me is where the real wisdom comes from. We can read books and we can study things, but it's how we actually apply that, how we use it. And if we have, then it becomes embodied. And when it becomes embodied, now it's not just an idea anymore. It's something that is, this is the way that I live. And so I can speak from that place because this is how I live.
Yeah, and I'm always so surprised. I mean, I saw your wife, your kids, you came to my Monday morning motivation anniversary party, and there's definitely something special around all of you. And I remember you told me about the homeschooling idea before. I mean, I had met you. You were in Canada at that time. And I remember you were saying with an RV or so, you were going through whole Canada while your kids were like in school, or you homeschooled them. Then you came back to China. And I think now soon you're about to leave the country again. Like, how does it work? I thought because I'm from Germany, I don't even know if this is allowed in Germany. All I know is that in the books in the US, when I learned English, it's all about, homeschooling is an option. I don't know anything about this, that you can do this in China, or why would you even do this, or I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I have some prejudices. It sounds weird to me.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are different laws in different countries about this kind of thing. I think Germany, if I'm not wrong, is one of those countries that is more strict, where I don't think you're allowed to homeschool your kids, although that might be changing now. China is another one of those countries where technically you're not allowed to homeschool your kids. Your kids have to go to school. But in other countries, there's different kind of flexible possibilities about this. And so, when my kids were young, and even before they were young, I kind of had this idea of, I did well in the education system, but in large part that was just like my personality. Like, some kids do well because they fit in the system, and some kids don't.
Yes.
And I saw some people really struggle in the system. And I mean, in my way, I also struggled a bit, not academically, but in terms of not being able to study the things that I wanted to study, like sitting in class and just being bored, being able to do the tests and all that, but being like, what is this all for? Why am I learning this specific content? So I was a bit frustrated with the education system myself. And I saw people like my stepbrother, who he's a brilliant actor, like a performer, but give him basic mathematical principles to try and figure out, and he'll be waiting a long time before they come through. Whereas, I'm a little bit different in that way. I love maths and science and writing, and so the school system worked well for me. But I could see, from a young age, especially my eldest son, he's much more of the creative type. He's much more of he's not that interested in, reading books or kind of learning things that, are taught in school, even basic things like the alphabet. But he's an amazing artist, he can draw and express himself through the medium of, whether it's painting or drawing or give him any sort of material, any sort of, you can give him rubbish. He goes searching in the garbage for boxes and things, and he creates the most amazing things out of it.
Okay.
But that's not the kind of skill that you get to practice very much in school.
Yes.
So I saw that from a young age, and I was if we put him in the school system, he has to sit and listen and do what all the other kids are going to be doing. he's going to struggle. And so that's part of where this idea of homeschooling came from. I was like, you know, he's someone that we likely have to do something different with. So I was doing all this different research and what are the best educational philosophies out there, the best educational systems. And the kind of conclusion that I came to is a little bit what I was telling you earlier about parenting, that there is no the best.
Yes.
It depends on your child.
Yes.
That there are different systems that are better for different types of children. You know, like some kids do much better in a more kind of natural, like Waldorf type education, which is much more kind of free flowing, lots of games, lots of singing and dancing and things like this. Some kids do very well in a structured, you know, like this from this class to this class. These are the different classes you do. You study this and this and this. That would be great in that kind of structure, right? Other children don't even fit very well in either of those kinds of systems. They're kind of more like if I take the example of my son, he's much more like he needs to be making things. He needs to be building things. He's a project-based learner, you know, as opposed to like a conceptual idea-based learner.
Yeah.
And so, you know, looking around the world at different educational systems, I was like, there aren't all that many project-based systems out there. Most of them are curriculum-based or, you know, test-based, standardized-based. And I know that he's likely to struggle in a system like that based on his personality. So how can I find a system that works for him?
Yeah.
So that's actually what I did, is that master's degree that I did was actually in a specific form of philosophy of education and human development that is based on this idea that each of us are unique. And like with coaching, right? How do I treat each coaching client in their own unique way, right? Because they're different than the last coaching client. And any standardized coaching template isn't necessarily going to work with them. So with this educational philosophy, what I learned was there was this specific system that was set up by a guy who one day his daughter came home from kindergarten and she said, I don't want to go back. And he said, why? She said, well, I was outside swinging on the swing. And the teacher said, it's time to come back in now and do this other activity. And she was like, I don't want to do that. I want to keep swinging on the swing. And the teacher's like, no, you have to come in now because now is the next time when we do this next activity. And so she came home to her father and he was like, okay, well, if you don't want to go back to kindergarten, what do you want to do? And she says, well, I just want to keep learning with you the way I have been learning for these past few years since I've been growing up with you.
Interesting.
So he said, okay. So he quit his job and he basically set up a school around her. And he said, I'm going to trust in your innate natural wisdom to tell me what you want to learn. And he started gathering a community of kids together who all didn't necessarily fit very well in the school system. They maybe weren't happy or they didn't want to go to school or whatever it was. And he let them tell him what they wanted to learn. And essentially, so they would have resources to use and they would decide as groups or teams. Some kids would go off and design their own things, some would work in teams. They would have a budget, and so they would interview teachers and say, like, we want to learn this, we want to learn this. Do they speak to like a Japanese teacher or an art teacher or whatever? And they choose, oh, I want to learn Japanese. Yes. So they get together and they pay their budget to sort of hire this Japanese teacher and they all learn Japanese together. And this school grew up into, you know, a high school eventually, and then into a master's program, which is the master's program that I took, which is essentially design your own master's. What do you want to study? You decide. You want to find your own mentors? Go around the world, find the people that you want to learn from, and choose them as your professors, spend some time with them, create some sort of a project with them, and then that's what you get your master's degree on. Yeah. And so, you know, that philosophy is carried through into with my children in terms of ask them, what do they want to learn? What are they interested in? You know, what sort of things, activities do they want to be doing? And based on that, then, how do we organize activities around their specific interests? And so that's why we went on this RV world schooling trip, was to say, let's go out into the world, let them explore the world instead of sitting in like the box of a classroom. You know, how do we just go out to the world and let them explore and tell us what they're interested in? So we spent, that was pre-COVID, we spent a year traveling around in a camper in North America, the US and Canada, and just finding different places for us to go as a family and to explore and to let them go to like forest schools and go snowboarding and you know, basically whatever they were interested in, we followed their lead. And that was one of the beautiful things about being able to do the kind of work that I do as a coach is all I need is an internet connection and, you know, Wi-Fi now, as long as you have a 4G connection on your phone, you can get it almost anywhere, except I've discovered some remote mountains you can't. And based on that, then just a conversation like this. And, I get to then be able to fund my family to travel around. Now, when COVID hit, we decided that, maybe that kind of flexible lifestyle wasn't the best choice. So we actually at that time decided to come back to China.
Yes.
We did the homeschooling thing for about 6 months or so. And we found that context matters, like I said, right? So here in Shanghai, there aren't really any other kids who do this. So there weren't really any other kids to play with because all the kids were in piano class or chess class or whatever, they were in some sort of extracurricular activity or they were in school. And you know how it is here with, the whole kind of tiger mom, like pushing kids to perform very hard. It's like literally kids don't have a minute of the day to spare.
They're so busy from an early age. It's crazy.
It's quite intense. And so we decided that if we're going to stay in China for a year or two while COVID is happening, and now we're leaving 2 years later, that actually what we'll do is we will, let them experience the Chinese school system, right? They're half Chinese.
So not an international school, Chinese local school.
Local public school. We looked at international schools. It's like, well, if we're going to be in China, why go to an international school? They're Chinese. It's important for them to also experience Chinese culture, to learn how to read and write really well in Chinese, and to really experience what it's like for Chinese people to go through this, for them to understand their identity as Chinese. So they've spent the last 2 years in the Chinese school system, and it's like a complete 100-degree, 80-degree opposite from what we were doing before.
What was their feedback so far?
It's been fascinating to see, like, for example, I've been talking about my eldest son who doesn't fit very well in the school system. It's been a real struggle, but I would say not necessarily for him. It's been a real struggle, more so for us as parents, to really figure out how do we support him in the system? Because he goes to school and he's happy. He gets to meet his other classmates. He listens to the teacher. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he is going to perform according to the expectations of the teacher.
Yes.
So then the teacher might come to my wife, and speak to her about, well, he's not actually listening in class, or, he's not actually doing as much homework as he should be doing. And then my wife feels a little like, ooh, like this social pressure. Like, I'm Chinese, my Chinese son should also probably be performing at the standard that, so then that pressure then can come out in the home. It's like, should he be performing? Should he not be performing? We're actually not going to be in the system for very long. So, how hard do we want to push him? And it's been really incredible to see his progress over time. He can now read and write beautifully in Chinese.
Oh, I'm jealous.
Yeah, seriously, he kind of puts me to shame a little bit. I can speak pretty well, but I gave up writing a long time ago. And I can read fine, but obviously his pronunciation is a lot better than me. He's like a native speaker. And while mine is fluent, you can still hear that I'm a foreigner, of course. And so, it's been really beautiful to see him learn. But one of the things that really surprised me was, for the first few months, one of the things that they do here in the Chinese education system is they memorize poetry from like Tang Dynasty, that time period poetry. And
how old are your kids again? 8 and
6.
Wow.
And so, this is something to a foreigner, it's kind of like memorizing poetry. Like maybe we do that in high school, at least, in my schooling system. We definitely didn't do it in 1st and 2nd grade.
Yes.
But they have like a number of different poems that they need to memorize. So to try and get him to memorize these poems, it was like pulling teeth.
Oh gosh.
It was like, he's not a memorization kid. To get him to sit down and focus for 10 seconds is a challenge, regardless of trying to get him to focus on the entire poem. But, we sat with him and we tried to do it in a way that worked for him. And after, months of work and helping him to kind of work through this, eventually, he could just recite them off. And it was almost like he hadn't memorized them. It was almost like he'd heard them so many times that he could just, say them over and over again. And when I asked him at the end of his first year of school, what did you like most about what you learned? And I was probably thinking, he's probably going to say something like, well, the art class was nice and I liked drawing, those kind of things. And he did say that he liked that, but he said the thing that he actually liked the most was that he now knew these Chinese poems, and it just shocked me. I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, before I didn't think I could do it. And then And then I kept learning again and 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 again. And now I can say the poem. I feel quite proud of myself about that.
Congratulations.
Wow. And then I asked him about, because in his second grade, he had a much more, let's say, mellow teacher. In his first grade, the teacher was very strict. And so I asked him when he was going into second grade, like, what do you think about your new teacher? Like, expecting him to be like, oh, she's so much more nice than the other teacher. And he says, I miss my old teacher. And I said, like, why? And he said, well, because my other teacher was so strict that most of the time she said I was doing a really bad job. But when she did say something good, which didn't happen very often, I really knew I did a good job. So I was like, wow, that, like that different perspective of the importance of the other side, right, of being able to help people break through their limits, helping him with his grit, right? Helping him to move through things that he doesn't necessarily want to do, but are also important for him in his development. Now we're getting to the period where I'm kind of like, okay, that's a little bit enough of that. It's time to go back to Canada now and let him go back into forest school and explore nature and all of that. But it's been a good run for 2 years, and I think he's learned a lot, and we've learned a lot as a family. And there's been many gifts that have come through that. Trauma from my wife's childhood that has come up, in her own education in the Chinese system that we've had to deal with face to face and help as a family to move through. So that we don't pass that on to the next generation. So it's been a real gift, but we're also at the point now where we're ready to go and have something else that maybe suits them a little bit better.
You always make these things sound so easy, but I mean, a lot of the things you've told me sound new to me. I mean, I'm not a parent yet, but yeah, interesting. So I actually also liked, as a business owner, you actually inspired me just also when you said, find the people you want to learn from. I mean, you don't need to be a business owner, right? You don't need to be a parent or a child, but I think we can all like actually contact and have a meeting or a coffee with somebody we want to learn from. Through these one-on-one conversations, we can really learn a lot. Thanks for all the sharings as a parent. I think I already got some inspiration here. Now let's talk a bit about like work and life, because you have that very special balance, I think, and you have set some rules for yourself. Can you share what they are, or what the philosophy is behind this? Now for yourself, basically, and your family.
Yeah. So I'll come back again to this concept of context, right? Because like when we were in Canada, the lifestyle there was such that I didn't actually need that much money to survive on a weekly basis. Like we had to pay money to fill up the fuel tank in the RV. Our electricity was all covered by solar. So I had to pay my phone bill for the Wi-Fi, and had to pay fuel, and had to pay for food for the family. But that was basically it. So I could do 1, maybe 2 coaching sessions a day, and we were fine. We could travel around, explore the world, all of that was fine. Now, context matters. So when we came back to China, it's a little bit different here. Rent here is not all that cheap. Rent here is not all that cheap. At the same time, we decided that we're going to buy a property here, So then I sort of said, okay, well, if that's our goal over the next year or two, we want to buy a property in Shanghai, then, probably have to work a little bit harder. And at the same time, we decided that we were going to put the kids in public school. So I was like, oh, I have a lot of extra time during the day if I'm not homeschooling them, right? So, okay, let me pick up, extra things to do. I picked up more coaching clients. Shanghai is a great place to do that.
Yes.
I picked up some, different types of consulting gigs, things that I really enjoy. A lot of them are in the coaching or educational space, or, parenting, family dynamic space. And like this one organization that I consult for, which it works with, let's say, like the world's biggest family businesses. And so I get to kind of go into these family businesses and work with the leaders and their families, and support like multi-generational stuff, right? So there might be like a generation that is the founding fathers, and then the kind of the succession, like the next generation that's coming through that's maybe not quite ready to lead yet. And that generation maybe is having children, so it's like 3 or sometimes even 4 generations there. The complexity of those dynamics, right, of helping families is one of the things that I really love. So I go in as a coach. What I also do is I find other coaches around the world, coaches or therapists, and we work in the whole spectrum of like physical, mental, emotional, relational health and well-being.
Wow.
And so I look at, like traditional Chinese medicine doctors or Ayurvedic doctors from India, right?
Wow.
We look at nutritionists, naturopaths, could even be energy healers. We look at, on the mental or emotional side, it could be, leadership coaches, or it could be psychotherapists, psychiatrists. And kind of my role is to kind of look at the family and what are all the different types of experts that would be useful to them, and how can we create journeys for these different families to go through and improve their family dynamics for them to be more harmonious, for them to be able to find that place where the succession to the next generation. Some of these families run the biggest businesses in the world, right?
Wow.
So how do they actually successfully pass on the business to the next generation, so it's both a successful business and a successful family, and marrying those complexities together?
I was just meeting a friend yesterday who's about to leave Shanghai after 16 years. And he actually comes from a family business background and has like the issues now with the new generation of his dad's partners, basically. Yeah. So maybe I should connect you.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a very good point, because right now they started talking through lawyers, which is a pity as well.
Yeah, exactly.
You were talking about journeys now. So what is your journey on earth here? What's your purpose in life that you're fulfilling? If you found it. You said I can ask you anything, right?
Go for it. Well, the first thing I'll say is that it's evolved over time, right? So I feel like purpose, that word, is one of those things where, and especially in the kind of the coaching community, we can get locked in this idea as if there's only one purpose, and once I've got that purpose, it's done. And I see it a little bit more like a journey of moving from one purpose to the next, right? And while there might be kind of a core essence that starts to come through, that starts to become more clear over time, that essence also evolves with our own development. Like I was saying, I studied human development. One of the things that I realized is that as we move through this journey of life, our values shift and they change, right? And based on those values, then our purpose shifts and it changes. Right? So we might find that early on, and let's say, for example, when we're coming out of university, we're an expert in something. It's all about learning. It's all about specialization. It's all about, getting really good at something specific. Yeah. Right? Then maybe we go out into the world and we want to use those skills that we've learned or we've developed to be able to create something new. And that's where often like the, climbing the corporate ladder, or, going into that space of entrepreneurship, creating something new with these skills that we have. It's like, often it's about achievement, performance, doing the best, how can I continually improve myself, right? And so often then at that point, when we're going through that phase, we're kind of looking at our purpose is often about, growing, it's about, continually becoming our best self. Right?
Yes.
And as we evolve through that, often people find that they come out the other side of that where they feel like they have become successful. They have really been able to achieve their kind of lifetime goals. And then they move into a space often of kind of wanting to give back somehow, like wanting to, share with others, wanting to be able to, whether it's, women's empowerment, or supporting the environment, or, supporting minorities of some kind of disenfranchised, portion of the population. And so there becomes kind of this idea of impact, right? It's not just now about improving myself. It's now about how do I make a greater impact? How do I do something bigger that's beyond me? And beyond that, even then, often people can evolve to kind of a new stage of development, which goes beyond just that impact, and we see things from almost like more like a global meta-systemic scale, right? Where we see all these interacting systems. We have all these challenges in the world right now, like from the pandemic to pollution, to global warming, to war, to like we can keep that list is so long and just growing, right? How do we start to look at the whole picture? And how do we start to do things that actually don't just necessarily focus on one thing, but actually start to shift that entire picture? And and the research has shown us that actually there are several stages of development that continue on beyond that, but we don't actually have very many people who continue beyond that on planet Earth at this point in time. And so one of the things that I specialize in and that I'm passionate about is kind of supporting people through that developmental journey, and to really look at like, what is the leading edge of planet Earth right now? Like, what are the places where we have entirely new ways of being coming online? And so we can see this even if we just look at nations on planet Earth. There are some nations that are more developed and some nations that are less developed.
Yes.
And we can see that the value systems of those nations can be quite radically different, right? Mm-hmm. So we have some nations that are almost more like just survival, right? It's like just keeping the nation together, you know, and you know, getting people's basic needs met, right? Mm-hmm. So I grew up in Africa, and there's a lot of countries that really, you know, people are struggling for survival on a daily basis. Yeah. And so there isn't necessarily that cohesion in the country of even a kind of a general rule of law, right? Mm-hmm. Or a general kind of national identity of we all do things this way, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we're finding is that as countries develop, and there's certain things that get put in place, you know, like for example, economic development supports, like we've seen in China over the last 30 years, yeah. It's just blown up economically, which has created the space for now the Chinese orientation, the whole culture to evolve as well and to develop on a more psychological basis. And so if we look at kind of probably some of the more advanced or progressive societies on planet Earth, we might point at like the Nordic countries, or we might point at like in New Zealand, or countries where, you know, maybe like Germany is kind of almost, but maybe yeah. Not quite, because it's also a big country, a lot of people, it's, you know, still quite industrial, you know. Okay. But we see the value system, there's a progression of value systems. And in countries, for example, if we take the Nordic countries, you know, we have systems where the welfare system is quite strong. Yes. You know, where people are taken care of. Where if we look at the education system, I mean, you know, take Finland as an example, right? Leading educational system in the world, but not just because the students perform better, right? But because it's whole person education. Right? They care for the whole person.
They learn parts from Germany, just for the records.
For sure. So there's actually a concept that comes out of that kind of, and I think Bildung, is that a German word?
Yes.
So the Bildung philosophy is actually what's been incorporated in some of the Nordic countries that has helped them to develop at a rapid pace. And there's a brilliant book on it called The Nordic Secret, which looks back at how the Nordic countries have actually gotten to where they are. And you're actually right, some of it has been borrowed from Germany and German philosophers and understandings of the way the world works, the way that reality works. And that if society is set up in a certain way, that the psychological maturity of the population actually will develop at a faster rate. And so that's actually what is needed when we talk about like stability in a country, you know, or for things like democracy to work. Yes. You know, democracy is an ideal that is touted by the West as something that, you know, should be universal, that all countries should have it. And actually the research is showing us that some countries are not quite ready for it. That actually you need the population to be at a certain level of education, for example, in order for them to make wise decisions about the leadership or things like this. So there's things like that on a global scale right now that we can look at and see from this meta-systemic level of what are the acupuncture points, what are the nodes that can be hit on planet Earth right now that will support the development of our entire species.
And it's interesting when you mentioned this about the Nordic countries, because if you look at the world's happiness index, the Nordic countries are actually, like, every year, the number one countries that are the happiest. Like currently it's Finland, earlier it was Denmark, and so on.
Norway, Sweden.
Yeah, it does make sense. Beautiful. Last question that you just mentioned. So when the people are developing beyond, were you talking about something like enlightenment or?
So the word enlightenment gets thrown around a lot.
Okay.
And, you know, it really depends how someone would define that. So one of the things that's useful to make a distinction between is we can call that vertical development. That's these stages that I've been talking about. But we also have something called horizontal development, which is really filling out a stage or filling out a kind of a level. And one of the things that we find is you can kind of go, you know, along this vertical development scale, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your stages or your levels of development are filled out really well. So what we can actually end up happening is we have shadow or trauma that has happened earlier on, and people have maybe accelerated their development, but there's bits that are missing. And that's where, if we, I mean, you brought up Germany as a topic, Hitler is an example, of someone who actually probably had quite late developmental capacities, but had a lot of shadow and trauma in his childhood that hadn't been resolved. That ended up meaning that he had this incredible capacity to see things in a very complex way, but use that capacity in a very traumatic way to the rest of the population. So that's one of the things that we want to be careful about, is not just talking about vertical development, but also about how do we fill people out in healthy ways at every stage. And so when we talk about words like enlightenment, we can get the concept of enlightenment, depending on how we define it, at any stage of development. Right? Is if someone is just fully, deeply at one with the world at that stage of development. Okay. And so one of the things that we can look at is, this whole scale of development is more about being able to take wider and wider, more expansive perspectives. Right? But in some contexts, that's not necessarily useful or necessary, right? So if we look at like a small village out in the middle of nowhere that has very little contact with the rest of the world, understanding these global dynamics doesn't really help in day-to-day life. But what does is really basic, hard, concrete things that are the basis of how do I just be a really good person, right? How can I just be at one with my community, right? How can I just really care and love and be supportive and in service of the people around me? You don't need late complexity to be able to do that in that kind of a context, right? But now the reality is that we live in a globalizing, polarizing, complex world where if you don't have that kind of later stage capacity, it can be hard to make sense of the complexity that is going on.
Interesting. I remember like before, a few weeks ago, this was before lockdown actually, when we had coaching, you were super happy you shared it with me because you did a lot of shadow work on yourself.
Yeah. And that for me is really, the core part of this that is really important to emphasize, maybe even more so than the kind of the later development or kind of looking at late stages or seeing things from these complex perspectives, is how can we be healthy where we are? Because if we can be healthy where we are, then we can meet the demands of the world around us, and we can do it in a way that causes less suffering. Right? Coming back to the Chinese or Buddhist concept of reducing suffering, right? How can we meet the world in a way, or the Taoist principle of just going with the flow, going with nature, right? Being at one with the way, with the Tao, right? And so for me, that doesn't necessarily require all this later stage capacities, but with later stage capacities comes more ability to be able to deal in more different types of contexts. And so, when we talk about something like enlightenment, we can look at it in that terms and we can say, yes, how do I fill out all these different, developmental perspectives or fields that I have? But also, how can I do it in a way that evolves the whole human race, right? Or the whole of connecting us with the universe, or to come into oneness with all that is, or different religious traditions or spiritual traditions, different ways of looking at this. And often we can look at religion from a modern perspective and throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right? Go like, well, that's old news, like who believes in that stuff anymore? And it's like, well, actually, there can be a lot of wisdom in those traditions. So while there's some things that we can throw out, maybe the dogmatism, of like, I grew up in a Christian Catholic family.
Oh, really?
And there's a lot of things that I had to throw away,
I would not have guessed that.
Right? And so, but at the same time, there's a lot of wisdom. And how do we reclaim that wisdom from these wisdom traditions and come at it from not just a postmodern, but a meta-modern, kind of looking at not just but a perspective that is beyond. And that's where I think concepts like enlightenment can get in the way and just make things seem like, oh, there's this destination to get to, like an enlightened being that I can somehow get to that place. And it's more like, how do we just come back into who we are, do the shadow work, the healing work with our children, the basic everyday stuff, or just in our life, whatever's coming up. How can we just be fully human? And if we can do that, and do that in beautiful, caring, loving ways, then in our own way, we can make the world a better place.
That sounds like beautiful closing words. Wow, our talk has been quite long, longer than the other ones. Thank you so much for your time. Are there any other last sharings that you want to send to our viewers out there in the world?
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here with you, Janine, and I'm really grateful for you opening up this space for us to share and for us to talk about these topics. I think the real thing to leave with is, maybe just the simple concept of love. And, whether it's love with our family or love with our coaching clients or love with our clients and, other businesses, or just being loving in other ways, how can we really just open up to the humanness in others? Being, a vulnerable, open, honest human being. We all have egos, right? Let's not ignore it, or let's not deny it, right? But the more we can acknowledge what's coming from a place of ego and what's coming from a place of love, and we can make those conscious choices to be more loving and caring in the world, then that for me feels like a beautiful direction to go.
Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much for being my coach, Fionn. Thank goodness I still was able to see you in person before you are taking off to Canada, and now that the lockdown is more or less over. Guys, I hope you liked our session today with Coach Fionn. Why not send it to your friends, your family members, anybody who needs to be inspired, your clients, your partners, your parents, your kids, who knows? That was super inspirational, and have a great day, guys. This was Janine Jakob and Coach Beon.